Hello and welcome. My name is Lyndon Bird. I'm the chairman of the DRI Future Vision Committee, and this session is designed to present and discuss the most recent publications issued by the DRI Future Vision Committee. I guess over the years I've spoken to many of you face-to-face at conference or maybe in other events in the US or around the world. When I left last year from our conference in Savannah, I was really looking forward to going to Seattle this year. However, events have rapidly changed, and clearly we now have to do things in an entirely different way. As we said in the recent DRI predictions report, 2020 was a year no one predicted and no one is ever likely to forget. So before I say anything further, I'd just like to say that in my opinion, there are very few benefits to be gained by not having face-to-face conferences. But there is one, and that is the ability for us to get together a range of speakers, which perhaps would be quite difficult to manage to get together to come to one particular location at the end of February, beginning of March, as we usually have to do for conference. So this particularly is the case in the Future Visions Committee, for the simple reason that our committee is very international. It's not normally possible to get so many different people together at a single venue. So it's good that we've been able to get together on this event today, a good cross-section of our committee. They're going to tell us how they think about the world, how they think we're going to move on after COVID-19. They're going to tell us that globally, and they're going to give us some insight about their particular regions. On the program today, we have speakers from the UK, from the US, from the European Union, from Australia, from Japan. They're all well known in various aspects of resilience, with specializations in security, technology, emergency management, academic research, and risk insight. We have a UK citizen who lives in Italy. We have a citizen of the Philippines who lives in the UK. We have a professor, we have several published authors, and we have government advisors. A real cross-section of global expertise in the field of resilience. Before they start, however, I'd like to tell you about two of the key outputs from the Future Vision Committee. These are our two annual reports. The first one, published in early December each year, is called the Trends Report. And about a month later, in early January, we follow that with the annual Predictions Report. These reports have been produced now for the last 6 years and provide some excellent information, fascinating thoughts and opinions and views on what is going on both around the world and also in our resilience profession itself. If you've not actually seen any of these reports before, I really encourage you to have a look at them. They are full of data, information, thoughts of professionals around the world, and I learn a lot from helping compile them. So I suggest that you perhaps do download them, check them out, at least the more recent ones. This year, of course, in either of our reports, we couldn't write much about it without referring constantly to COVID-19. Therefore, in the Trends Report, as well as our normal output, we decided to include a survey about how well we feel our industry has responded to the challenge of COVID-19 and the likely long-term business changes we may have to incorporate into our future plans and our future resilience programs. 2 years ago, when we were in Vegas, if a conference speaker had come along with a case study or a presentation indicating a global pandemic, which even had perhaps 1/10 of the impact of COVID-19, I suspect they'd have been seen as a little bit unrealistic. And perhaps a few people might have thought they were a bit crazy. Yet that's what actually happened. So I hope I never again have to hear someone tell me, as I've heard many times in the past, oh, we don't need to worry about that particular risk. That could never happen. And even if it could happen, it never will happen. And if it did happen, it won't be that important. I think we don't want to hear those stories again, because clearly COVID-19 has demonstrated to us the fact that if anything could happen, it will eventually, and we need to be ready for it. I'll be back later in the session to provide you with some more highlights of the reports and perhaps also discuss a little bit about how we see the future post-COVID. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker. This is Andrea Bonin Blanc. Andrea is a true visionary who shares her extensive research and study through the book she publishes and many other publications. She influences opinion formers, business leaders, academic experts in many countries across many sectors. And perhaps you can tell us a little about how you see the post-COVID world. Will the global crisis lead to better international cooperation or a more nationalistic and protectionist mindset? What are the global political changes we can expect? And will these lead to a more internationally coordinated resilience approach? Andrea.
Greetings, and thank you very much for that great introduction, Lyndon. I'm delighted to be here to share some thoughts about 2021 and beyond. One of the things that I like to think about when I'm thinking about future trends is not just thinking about the next quarter or the next year, but thinking about the mega trends. And I've written about it and talked about it before. And I think for this year, 2021 is such an unusual year, because 2020 was so unusual, but also because 2020 really helped to reveal a lot of things that were already there. So based on your question, Lyndon, what does the post-COVID world look like from mostly a geopolitical, political standpoint? Are we going to have more international cooperation or less? I think I have good news and I have mediocre or challenging news. And what I would start with is the good news. I think we are going to have more international cooperation going forward for a little time, at least. And I think there's another piece to that puzzle in terms of international cooperation, which is that we live in a time of existential systemic threats that threaten the entire globe. And so I think for that very reason, we're going to see a continuation of the really great cooperation, for example, that we saw not necessarily amongst nations, but amongst scientists from many different places who accomplished something completely, never seen before in this world, getting not one, not two, but several vaccines done at the speed of light. So I think that's the good news part of the near future. Then I see another major theme geopolitically. It's no longer communism versus capitalism or, the Cold War as we knew it way back. It's democracy versus autocracy. The world blocs are going to be changing into those that do not believe in constitutional rights and freedoms and those who do. Very, very related is a third trend, a geopolitical trend, which also suffuses our daily lives, which is this trust versus suspicion, real versus fake, information versus misinformation. And so to me, that's going to be a very fraught piece of the puzzle that responsible countries, responsible companies have to deal with from a technology standpoint. And that leads me to my fourth sort of geopolitical megatrend, but also economic, and that is the rise of stakeholder capitalism. We're seeing it everywhere. And the real question there, and I think the stakeholder piece of it gives us a clue, is whether we're going to continue with the sort of unbridled capitalism that we've seen, certainly in the United States, but in several of the European countries as well, or are we going to go into a new phase of smartly regulated capitalism where the government is actually involved in protecting stakeholders against some of the worst things that are happening out there in the world. Pandemics, for example, climate issues, for example, social justice issues, for example, the restoration of democracy. So I think those 4 trends from a geopolitical standpoint will be occurring over the next couple of years, and we need to sort of focus our energies on doing a constructive, empathetic job. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for your attention. Look forward to hearing thoughts and feedback, and wish you the very best for 2021.
Thank you, Andrea, for your challenging and thought-provoking ideas. Our next speaker is Richard Knowlton, my go-to person for strategic thinking on all aspects of information operational security. Richard is an international expert on cyber risk and cyber terrorism and how they link into the overall resilience agenda. Richard, do you think that business has been as vigilant as they should have been during the COVID crisis? What would you see as the main security risks facing the Western democracies over the next few years?
Thanks, Lyndon. I'm assuming that you're thinking about working from home. I don't particularly trust any of the statistics, but it's clear that cyber attacks have increased by many multiples over the last year. Obviously, it's difficult to generalize, but I can certainly see an overriding theme. During the crisis, we've all got used to hearing about smart working, but most people don't understand that smart working has a specific meaning. It's not just another way of saying remote working or working from home. Smart working means a planned and orderly shift from the office to remote working. It's based on agreement with employees on goals, objectives, working hours, and so on. It promises greater efficiency and flexibility to employers and a better work-life balance for employees. What we saw in 2020 wasn't a move to genuine smart working at all. Governments simply ordered organizations to move to remote, that's usually home working, as an urgent emergency measure. Larger companies already had some experience of true smart working. They'd thought about the security challenges of working from home, and crucially, they'd also thought about the so-called human factor, their security culture and the security awareness of their people. So those companies that already had a plan in which security played an important part have inevitably been more vigilant during the crisis. They've tended to manage the COVID emergency reasonably well. But, and it's a big but, most companies did not have a plan for remote working. If they'd thought about it at all, many executives probably assumed that pandemics only happen once a century, as opposed to the 3 we've actually seen in the first 20 years of this one. When COVID arrived, these executives had some serious business issues to confront, like the impacts on their business models and supply chains. On top of that, most companies simply weren't ready to meet the security challenges of the pandemic. Those challenges were always going to be significant, not just in terms of technology and processes, but also in terms of the security awareness and security culture of their staff. We've known for years that hacking techniques like phishing succeed because our people are untrained, unaware, or careless, and that they bring big rewards to criminals through extortion methods like ransomware. So it was really no surprise that there were security problems when, more or less overnight, so many companies made an unplanned, unthought through transition from a relatively secure office environment to working from home. The bad guys, as always, moved fast to exploit the extra opportunities that the crisis gifted them. So I'd say a mixed picture. And as always in resiliency, those companies that had a plan have come off best. Now, your second question is a great one, and honestly, it really needs a conference on its own. I can't do much justice to it in a few minutes, except to give some headlines about what I see as the main cyber threats. The general political, social, and economic context hasn't looked so hostile and frankly scary since at least the 1950s, and arguably even longer. Actually, that's something I've said every year for at least the last 10, but it's still true. So how do you begin to prioritize the cyber risks if you're in government? I'd start with state-sponsored hacking. It's scored remarkable successes in the Western liberal democracies. Just in the last month or so, we've been reading about the devastating SolarWinds attacks that seem to have penetrated every level of government in the US and elsewhere. I say seem to because it could be years before we really understand the impacts. And state-sponsored hacking isn't just targeting governments. It's regularly sucked huge quantities of information out of universities, think tanks, and medical research facilities, as well, of course, as the private sector. But most worrying to me at the state level is the cyber arms race. We've known for some years that malevolent states are developing and testing their capability to attack and to disable key parts of our critical national infrastructures, including in space. A major problem is that this whole area of activity is literally lawless. If the country of Utopia bombs Ruritania's power supply system, then that's an act of war in anybody's money. If Utopia cripples the power system through an unattributable cyber attack, though, what's an appropriate response for Ruritania to make? Should we be reassured that Western democracies are now developing their own cyber attack forces capable of retaliation? Haven't we been here before in the 1950s and the 1960s? My third priority for Western governments must be organized crime. It's plenty of resources, including some of the best hackers, and no need to worry about international boundaries. Best of all, the chances of being caught or disrupted are minimal, with all respect to our friends in law enforcement. We know from history and experience that organized crime is a dangerous cancer in any country, whatever form it takes. It must remain at the top of risk priority lists of any liberal democracy. Finally, one extra word about government. It must make it a priority to work closely with the private sector on cybersecurity. This is something that still works much better in some of our countries than in others, and it needs much more effort. And I do worry that an excessive reliance on a compliance approach leads to a false sense of security. The fact that a company has ticked off a set of boxes mandated by a regulator emphatically does not mean that the company is secure. I know that I've left a lot of important topics hanging in the air, but I hope I've given a flavour of some of the issues that I'm currently thinking about.
Thank you, Richard. Fascinating as always. We now move right across the globe to meet David Porter from Australia. David, coming from the Southern Hemisphere, you might have a slightly different perspective of global risk than some of the other panelists. For example, your country is highly prone to heat waves and flooding. So do you place climate change at the top of your worry list? And how do you feel about the increasing power of China in your region?
Thanks, Lyndon, and hi, everybody. I guess first and foremost for climate change, that's really high on our worry list. I think in recent times it's been masked with the big COVID response, which is natural, but we're still getting frequent reminders in our daily lives. For us in Australia, we're in the middle of summer at the moment, so for us that's typically very hot days, strong northerly winds, and then storms in the afternoon blowing up from the south. The temperature range for us is anywhere from 105 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and sometimes that temperature variance happens in the course of an afternoon. So we do get frequent reminders of climate change. I'm no meteorologist, but for us, it feels like that the wet and dry cycle of the tropical areas of Australia that are up closer towards the equator feels like they're sort of coming down further south, down to the more populated areas around Sydney and Melbourne. For us, though, weather events and weather-driven events have had the most responses that we've had. From an emergency perspective and from a continuity perspective as well. And I guess, like, sure, IT outages and things, they're significant, but weather's scary, you know, and there's personal loss, and they're highly emotional events. And, you know, there's a big difference between not being able to access a website or do some transactions for a few days versus, you know, someone getting winched off a roof by a helicopter because they're, you know, the floodwaters are up to their roof line of their house. So absolutely feel the climate change and the propensity for these types of weather events to grow more severe and more widespread in nature, we're really going to need to pull our finger out and I guess improve our readiness to deal with climate change as well, and our resilience against it too. So definitely post-COVID, we expect some stronger developments in our approach to climate change in Australia from a policy perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective. Even as recent as this morning, there was some positioning of some solar farms in the outback, which for me it's a no-brainer. It's an obvious place to start throwing in some solar farms. So I think that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of some things to come in terms of our readiness for climate change. Now, as far as China goes, I guess it's a really interesting sort of area, and the rise of the power within China. We see it very much as multifaceted. I guess they're exerting power in political and military circles, which is sort of well documented, but also trade, manufacturing, and ownership, particularly around land and infrastructure, particularly for us here in Australia. A lot of us across the world rely on China for manufacturing, and there's a lot of unknowns among products. So the components and things that sit behind products and where they're manufactured aren't necessarily always evident. So in a supplier context, you might have two different suppliers, one based in Europe and one based in Asia Pacific region, but both of those different suppliers might actually have a reliance on componentry that comes out of one place in China. And we've seen some of that with some of the computer chips and things in various products, whether they're electronic devices or even cars at the moment as well. In Australia, we've probably seen things diversify from a trade perspective. China is our biggest trading partner, but we're probably seeing that being spread across more countries at the moment, which is good. And I think we can probably see some of that diversification to come in the future as well, particularly for us within the UK, Europe, and India have been on the rise for us in terms of trading partners. But at the end of the day, I guess China operates differently to, I guess, the Western countries and other businesses that we might be familiar with. So it's a complex arrangement, it's a complex dynamic, and it really just needs a differentiated approach. So dealing with various aspects of China is not necessarily the same as dealing with local businesses. And my observation has been that sometimes we've been a bit frustrated where we've tried to operate on those terms, not understanding some of the differences about how China operates. So I think that's probably the area for us to look at there. But I think from our perspective in the Australian region, diversification is probably a big focus for us at the moment. So that's about it for me. Thanks very much.
That was really interesting, David. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now we move northwards to Japan. Our next speaker is a very old friend of mine, Professor Kenji Watanabe. Kenji, coming from Japan and living in Tokyo, you are very used to the growth and intensity of a mega city. Do you think that home working will change the way the cities function? Or do you think they'll soon revert to their old mode? Do you see differences between how your country handled COVID emergencies and how it's been handled in the US or in Europe? Finally, have you any thoughts about the particular challenges coming out of holding the Tokyo Olympics, which have been rescheduled this year?
Hello folks, my name is Kenji Watanabe from Tokyo, Japan. I'm a professor of Nagoya Institute of Technology, and my professional areas are risk management, BCM, and CIP, critical infrastructure protection. Okay, now let's move to the given two questions. First question is, do you think that home working will change the way cities function, or do you think they will soon revert to their previous model? Okay, due to the COVID-19, many people and organizations in Tokyo have started to consider moving their homes or offices out from Tokyo metropolitan area, and some of them have actually did it during or after the first and second waves of COVID-19 infections. And we experienced population decline in Tokyo area for the first time in almost 30 years. However, the rest of the people and offices remain in Tokyo after that because of the sharp rise in real estate and office rent prices in the suburbs of Tokyo with reasonable accessibility and living environment. So the commuter congestions in the morning trains are coming back, unfortunately, and the people and business in Tokyo are going back to the old normal, not new normal. They have missed the chance to change their mode of living or operation and now passively wait for the restoring the third wave situation. Okay, now let's move to the second one. So second question is, do you see differences between how your country handled COVID-19 and the way it has been handled in Europe or the US? Not much difference from other major OECD countries. Our government agencies, private sector, medical professionals, and people are overwhelmed with responses to the moving situations COVID-19 on try and error. But interesting cases I'd like to share with you today are employee sharing. Same as other countries, Japanese airline companies have to suspend their flight services and many of their employees have become available to do nothing. In this situation, the Japanese two major airlines, JAL, Japan Airlines, and ANA, All Nippon Airlines, have coordinated employee sharing with a major home appliance store chain and a large supermarket chain who increased their sales with stay-home effect, and also with several municipal government offices to support handling applications and executions of the COVID-19 special financial aids for their residents and SMEs, small medium enterprises. The employees assigned for the sharing program are not laid off and keep employed with the airlines and work at the counterpart companies based on seconded contracts or dual employment contracts. The interest point is both origin companies and destination companies are trying to fill the temporary gap between labor demand and supply without losing their important human asset. So that must be one of the options for business continuity in the future or in the coming next COVID something. So those are my answers to the given the two questions. But one more thing I would like to add from my side is the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games 2020. As you know, it has been postponed to this year, but it is in danger of being postponed again or cancelled due to the continuous serious situations of COVID-19, not only in Japan, but also in the participating countries. Of course, IOC and JOC, Japan Olympic Committee, are still trying to find a way to hold it, even if they have games without an audience or reduce the scale of the event. But unfortunately, as we are getting tired to dealing with COVID-19, the passion of the people to support and the motivation of the athlete to participate in Japan are now a little bit diminishing. Considering our networked society with high speed and wide area movement of people and increasing frequency of pandemics, we have to reconsider how to arrange the future incoming Olympic Paralympic Games. My current suggestion is changing it to the World Cup style with regional tournament games for each of the 5 continents. But I would like to discuss this with you over a glass of beer, wine, or Japanese sake after the old COVID-19 waves have gone. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you, Kenji. To round off our speakers today, I'm pleased to be joined by another long-term friend and colleague, Patrick Alcantara. Patrick is a truly international professional, originating from the Philippines with degrees from UK and Spanish universities, and a career to date that has spanned continuity, risk, research, and insight. Patrick, all economies have had severe shocks. Governments have had to borrow and spend vast amounts, unprecedented amounts, in fact, on supporting their companies and employees. Do you believe that this will lead to fundamental changes about the role of government in future? And do you think that the social media platforms help or hinder rational debate of such highly complex issues?
Thank you, Lyndon. The current pandemic is indeed a significant shock to the world economy, and it has also exposed the fundamental link between human health and productivity. Simply put, you cannot have disease ripping through society and expect the economy to grow. As we ramp up vaccination as a way out of this pandemic, governments would have to support companies and employees in the meantime to stimulate the economy and avoid long-term damage, which might stunt long-term growth. Leading nations and economies have plowed massive amounts as stimulus. For example, the US has allocated $3.9 trillion as stimulus last year, with President Biden now proposing another $1.9 trillion. As an initial stimulus package, the UK has earmarked $450 billion, which also included a furlough scheme guaranteeing 80% of income for most earners. Germany, on the other hand, has passed a $680 billion stimulus package early last year, while the European Union has recently approved a $2.2 trillion budget and stimulus plan, which will be financed by joint debt. What is interesting is the fact that many of these economies are run by center-right politicians who are in principle more wary of spending. Public spending as well has been in retreat for a generation now, with a significant exception of the Great Recession last decade, where governments worldwide bailed out the financial sector to avoid damaging the wider economy. Whether this pandemic leads to further state intervention as a norm in the future is still out there. What both events, the pandemic currently and the banking crisis last decade, do demonstrate are the conditions that justify intervention. Massive shocks that force government to act. It will ultimately depend on the electorate whether more generous state support will be the norm. But early insights suggest that there is a broad consensus in supporting citizens and the economy and doing whatever it takes to accomplish that. Of course, we will soon have to deal with paying for that stimulus, whether that means raising taxes on the wealthy or businesses or everyone else. And this is a debate that will play out in every society post-pandemic. That said, I believe that this crisis might be a turning point for greater state involvement. People are being asked to make considerable sacrifices, and the only thing which keeps them going is the expectation that things will get better. The post-war society comes into mind, actually. Britain became a more egalitarian country as government became more interventionist back then, providing free healthcare, improving worker protections, and setting up a welfare state. Social media, of course, has a role in mediating this debate on state intervention, but recent experience has shown that it has contributed to increasing polarization. Social media algorithms often create bubbles or echo chambers where it is easier to get content that supports one's worldview instead of being open to other perspectives. Taken to an extreme, you get a situation where people don't agree on facts anymore. One good example being the recent US elections, where poll after poll suggests that a majority of US Republicans or conservatives believe in election fraud, while Democrats or liberals believe in the opposite. Of course, misinformation and hateful propaganda on social media also play a role. But the prerequisite of any rational debate is for people to be open to talk to one another, regardless of their political persuasion. People also need to agree on facts and assume good faith from the other side. Otherwise, we won't be able to agree on anything, much less a way forward. So, fact-checking information, or say, banning individuals who spread hate and misinformation, or increasing digital literacy can only touch the surface of the problem. We need society at large to come together. But one positive thing about crises is it often provides an opportunity to do just that. People coming together in pursuit of a bigger goal or the greater good. Leaders in government, business, and society have a crucial role in helping people come together. Because ultimately, resilience in times of crisis demands leadership and social cohesion.
Thank you, Patrick. So today you've heard 5 members of the Future Vision Committee. And I think you will agree that they've presented a very wide range of ideas and topics. I'm sure some you will agree with, and perhaps others you won't. That is exactly what the committee exists for, to debate and challenge ideas, not to agree with each other all the time. For me, it's a great honor to be able to chair a committee with so many talented and diverse resilience professionals aboard. But before we close today, I would like now to run through a few issues from the most recent reports. As I said in my introduction, we did include in our 2020 Trends report a survey of professionals' experience of dealing with COVID-19. This was a very interesting exercise to undertake and to analyse. I'm just going to share a few of the key figures, things that came out of that today, and I think you might find them also quite interesting. One simple question we asked people was, well, at what stage of the pandemic were you, and by you we meant you as an individual, as a resilience professional, or the resilience department within your organisation, first involved? And I was quite pleased and quite a little bit surprised to see that the majority were involved right from the start, even at the point when the virus was being reported in China and we had no absolute certainty of what it was going to do to us in our own countries. Overall, 72% of all the respondents said that they were heavily involved with the corporate strategic planning for how they were going to deal with the issues. And 77% were responsible for significant parts of the operational response and implementation. I think these are very good numbers and very encouraging numbers. However, there was one slightly negative number that came out of that. 8.3% of all respondents said they actually had no involvement at all in the corporate response to COVID-19. I must admit, I wonder what the corporations that these individuals work for actually considered a professional in the resilience field did if they were not going to be involved in the largest challenge that their corporation has probably faced ever, or certainly since the Second World War. So that's an interesting point of why that 8.3 were not involved at all, which we may try to explore on another occasion. Less positive overall, however, was the question which we asked, which was at the beginning of the emergence of the virus, did your company have a pandemic plan in place? And I was expecting the vast majority to say yes, and that is true. The vast majority did say yes, but there was 26, just under 26% who actually said they had no pandemic plans at all. And though many said they had a pandemic plan, the vast majority of them said they only had a basic plan, pretty much modelled on previous flu epidemics. So they had no real idea how to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. It would be unrealistic to assume that anyone would have a plan exactly to meet the magnitude of COVID-19 that we would accept. But 6.6% said they had a very comprehensive pandemic plan, which they were able to adapt very quickly. So 6.6% were very happy with what they had done from a pre-planning perspective, but well over 90% either didn't have a plan or felt the plan was very basic and very limited. So this was a a concerning result when we came to look at those results, bearing in mind that the people who were replying were, amongst them, all of them, resilience professionals, and most of them certified by DRI or highly qualified in some other way. So on that basis, that was a strange and slightly disappointing result. But then we asked the question about, well, how do you think, on reflection, bearing in mind that this was more or less at the end of what we might call the first wave. It would be interesting to go back and see how their views have changed as we've gone into waves 2 and 3. But at the end of the first wave, we said, well, how well do you think your organization overall handled the crisis? And the interesting thing was almost everyone did better than might have been expected, given their lack of plans. And in fact, only 4.5% felt their organization had performed badly. And this compares, if you remember back to the previous figures I gave you, with nearly 26% of the people who said they had no plans at all. So even those who had no pandemic plans at all still felt that they certainly hadn't performed badly. 46.7% felt they had performed very well. And yet only 6% felt they'd had a comprehensive plan. So there was actually no correlation at all, really, between what the level of your assessment of your pandemic plan was, even whether you had one or not, and your ability to get a good outcome in terms of how you performed as an organization. So this is a little bit concerning, but it did, on reflection, remind me very much of an old adage that's often quoted in our industry, attributed, I think, to former General and President Eisenhower, which went along the lines, in battle plans are often useless, but planning is indispensable. So that is, to me, has always been a key message of business continuity and resilience, is that we can't necessarily plan for every single thing that's going to happen. But the process we go by of understanding our organization, understanding what is important, understanding how we could respond, making sure that people are aware and people know what their roles are. All of these issues of a business continuity program are indispensable. So the planning is indispensable. Maybe you can't always plan exactly for what's going to happen. So I think that confirms, those results I think confirm probably very much what many of us have been thinking over many years. And then we turned our attention to, well, there's been a lot of changes. You had to operate in different ways. Some of those are obvious, like people have worked from home. Some of them may be less obvious, like modifications to working methods. Other than, I mean, working methods, not just IT working methods or home working methods, but actual methods of manufacture, methods of distribution. So significant operational method changes. So we asked what people thought of the things that had been changed during COVID and how likely they are to be replicated on a permanent basis in the future. And the top 5 in terms of what was expected to change as part of a new normal and continue in the future. Well, the first one was, I think it's no surprise to anybody, was that people expected more voluntary, full and part-time home working would become the norm. And I think that was generally popular with most people and generally taken as a likely outcome of the consequences of what we've had to do during this pandemic. Second one, again, not necessarily so popular, but likely to happen, and that is business travel itself. Although will increase from what obviously has been happening in the last year, it's likely to be reduced from what it perhaps was in previous eras. So with more use of Zoom, more use of all of the various video conferencing facilities that are around, it is likely that perhaps business travel may struggle to get back to anywhere near its previous levels. Third one, which I was a little bit concerned about and not really expecting so much, was that many people felt that the full-time home working would become compulsory for many. there wouldn't be an office option. There wouldn't be a blended situation. There wouldn't be a go to the office where for certain requirements, but work on your basic stuff at home, which is actually what many of us have been doing for many years, of course, anyway. So this idea that the people will just not have offices, that the offices will shut down, that that people will not have a work location other than at home, without necessarily thinking through the full implications of that, which we haven't got time to discuss today, but are very complex. This was less popular with people, although some people were quite happy with it because they like working from home. Fourthly, there was thoughts about supply chain. People have had to change their supply chains because they may not have been able to get goods and services from the situations that they were in before. And so they've had to find different ways of getting supplies, different ways of getting services to them. And some of that has been seen as perhaps a result of too much globalization, too many single suppliers, not enough replication, not enough general resilience in the supply chain. So there's a feel that this is going to have to change, and that there will be significant changes to the way that organizations look at resilience in their supply chains. And then a nice one perhaps for our profession is most people felt that perhaps there'd be increased spending on all aspects of resilience as a result of this. Well, we will see, particularly about number 5, but it will be interesting for me to see whether some of the others come to fruition as well. I really hope that you enjoyed today's session. We really enjoyed planning it and preparing it and putting it together and presenting it for you. So let's hope that next year we'll all meet up again somewhere, someplace where we can actually have a beer, have a chat, and enjoy talking business continuity and resilience. So with that, I'd like to thank you again and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.